Mirror. You know that horror movie trope about mirrors? The one where the protagonist is near a mirror, and they look or shift away from the mirror for just a moment. And when they look back, a ghost, killer, or some other entity appears, and then usually rapidly disappears when they turn around. I've always disliked looking into mirrors, and for a while, I convinced myself that it was caused by an overactive imagination combined with seeing this situation one too many times in a movie. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that it's much more than that. I don't dislike looking into mirrors, I'm afraid of it. Something has always just felt off about it. I recognize the image in my reflection as me, but it has never felt familiar. I brought it up to a friend once, and she goggled at me for a moment, and then laughed, though I could hear a tinge of fear behind it. What do you mean? You don't recognize your reflection? How is that even possible? It's the same reflection that you've been staring at your whole life. And she was right, of course. But that was part of the problem. My reflection has never felt normal to me. Not in the way that it should. Not in the way that it does to other people. I've observed the reflections of friends and family members when they're standing near mirrors. It doesn't feel the same. It feels connected to them. A simple mirror image. Even when their eyes meet mine in the mirror, I don't feel the oppressive feeling of other that I get when I meet my own eyes in my reflection. With no explanation that seemed to fit my experiences, I chalked it up to it just being a weird quirk and decided to just get on with my life. When I moved into my first apartment by myself, I removed all of the mirrors, except for one that I kept in my guest room. It stayed covered with a sheet unless I absolutely needed to use it. You'd be surprised how well you can get by without mirrors when you've been doing it your whole life. I even got pretty good at applying makeup without seeing what I was doing. Every once in a while, I'd catch my reflection in a mirror in a public bathroom, or if I looked wrong into my rearview mirror, and it would set my heart racing. I always felt menaced when it happened, and it would take me a few moments to calm down again. But all in all, I was doing fairly well with my mirror avoidance strategies. However, that all changed one day at work. I work in the artifact restoration department at my city's history museum. It's typically fascinating, delicate, and detailed work, and I love it. I mostly work with pottery or statues and carvings, but I always knew that one day someone would bring me an antique mirror to restore, and I would have no choice but to do it. I had been at the museum for 5 years, and it still hadn't happened. I had almost convinced myself that I was in the clear. Alas, that was not the case. It was late on a Friday when it was first brought to me. The museum director had it wheeled in under a sheet, but I immediately knew what it was. I could tell from the dread that practically exploded inside me. He beamed at me as he whipped the sheet off. "Isn't it magnificent?" he crowed. "Early 1700s. French." He smiled at me, waiting for my exclamations over its beauty, I'm sure. My breath felt like it was caught in my throat as I stared down my full reflection for the first time in what had been years. It looked back at me, also with a petrified expression, but it felt different, like my reflection's face was an act. A mimicking of my face, not an exact copy. I stood transfixed for a minute, trapped under my own gaze. Suddenly, the director stepped into my line of view, blocking the mirror from my sight. "Well, what do you think? Gorgeous, isn't it? Doesn't look like it needs too much work." "A little spit shy, maybe," he said with a grin, winking at me. "Yes, gorgeous," I mumbled. He must have noticed how white I had gone, because he recovered the mirror and put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't stress about it. I know you'll do a great job. And don't worry about starting today. You can get cracking on Monday." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with the mirror. I put my head in my hands and rubbed my temples with my thumbs. "Okay, you can do this," I whispered to myself. "You have the whole weekend to prepare." I looked up at the clock. 5:15. I grabbed my things and headed for the door. I'd deal with the mirror on Monday. I had almost made it all the way out of the building when I realized I had left my keys on my work table. Shit, I moaned. But there was nothing to be done for it. I needed the keys to lock up the building. Before I opened the door back to my workspace, I took a deep breath. It's just a stupid mirror, I said to myself. I stepped into the room. Everything looked normal. I stepped quickly past the mirror to my desk. I bent to open the drawer where I kept my keys, and when I turned around, the sheet that had been covering the mirror moments before was in a pile on the floor in front of it. My knees went weak, and I had to grab onto my desk to keep them from buckling. It just fell, that's all, I whispered out loud. When I walked by it quickly, it made a breeze that knocked it off. I felt deep down that that was not what had happened at all, but saying it out loud gave me enough courage to approach the mirror to replace the sheet. Once I was in front of it, I knelt down to grab the sheet, never once taking my eyes off of my reflection. As I straightened back up, I turned to face the mirror head-on. With one hand, I reached out and lightly pressed my fingertips against my reflections. My fingers stopped at the cold, hard glass. It was cold enough that the warmth from my fingers fogged up a little area around each tip. My reflection had the tiniest of smiles playing around her lips. I didn't feel myself smiling, but it was such a small one, perhaps I didn't notice myself doing it. I rearranged my face into grotesque poses just to make sure my reflection did it too. She did, but it brought me little comfort. I took a step forward until my face was practically touching the mirror. I could see every pore, every freckle. It looked familiar, but it felt alien. I breathed onto it, fogging the surface in front of my face. I slowly traced a heart into the fog. I saw my reflection do the same, but then I noticed something odd. I couldn't see the heart I drew in the reflection. My heart began to thump wildly in my chest. I hastily used my sleeve to wipe away the remnants of my breath. The fog in the reflection, however, remained. I sucked in a sharp breath of air and took a staggering step back. I pressed my palms into my eyelids until I saw stars. I slowly counted to 10 and opened my eyes. All I could see was my reflection staring worriedly back at me. She looked pale and faint, exactly how I felt. But it still didn't look or feel quite right. I threw the sheet back over the mirror and ran out of the building. By the time I arrived home, I had calmed down significantly. Enough that I was suddenly able to remember that I had a date that night. I groaned out loud. I didn't really want to go, but I actually did like this guy. We had already been on a few dates and had hit it off well, so I pulled myself together the best I could. By the time Nick arrived to pick me up, I had shaken off the vestiges of my earlier terror. While at dinner, he asked me how my day had been. I hesitated, not wanting to tell him about what had happened, or about my irrational and odd reactions to mirrors. But I suddenly realized that I had a desperate desire to tell someone about what had happened, even if it made me sound crazy. I relayed the story to him, never once looking into his eyes. I didn't want to see what I knew would be reflected there. Fear, anxiety, disgust. But when I finished and did look up, he was simply studying me. After a moment, he reached out and took my hand. "You know what I read once?" he asked. I shook my head silently. It was on one of those microblog, social media sites. It said, "What if the only reason we can't walk through mirrors is because our reflection blocks us? What if they know that the other side is horrifying and painful, and they are trying to keep us from ever crossing over?" He shrugged. "Just a weird thing I read. But it sounds like yours isn't trying to protect you. It's trying to get out of there," he said with a laugh. "Wouldn't that be something? That would explain why you feel like you do." I sat in stunned silence. My throat was as dry as the desert. I had to forcefully swallow several times before I could speak again. Yeah, that would be something. My mind was racing with what he had said as we left the restaurant. His little theory perfectly described how I felt, but I didn't know what to do with that information. It was nonsense, after all. I wanted only to go home at that point, but Nick grabbed my hand. I actually have something in mind for us to do tonight. But it's a surprise." I sighed internally, but smiled at him. "Sure, lead the way." We caught a cab and got out in front of what looked like an old abandoned warehouse. I might have thought that's what it was, too, if it wasn't for the line of people out the door. "What's this?" I asked. "It's an adventure space," he said with a huge smile. "Kind of like a playhouse for grown-ups. I've seen it advertised all over the place. There's supposed to be things to explore and climb on. Stuff like that." I couldn't help but smile at his infectious excitement. "Okay, let's check it out," I said with a giggle. The first few rooms were indeed a lot of climbing and twisting and bending and crawling. We kept losing each other, and then finding each other by the sound of our laughter. I was surprised at how much fun I was having. He grabbed my hand as we moved towards the last room. "I think you'll like this one the best," he said, pulling me forward. I was about to ask why, but the word died on my lips as we walked through the doorway. It was a room full of mirrors, a much larger and more terrifying version of a funhouse made for children. He shoved me further into the room so that the door behind us slammed shut. "To help you get over your fear," he said with another shove. Never before had I felt the level of fear that rose in my chest than at that moment. It was all-consuming. It wiped nearly every other thought from my mind. I was facing down hundreds of my own reflection, and they looked horrifying. I turned to Nick to beg him to help me out of there, but he had disappeared. "Nick," I croaked, my voice cracking with terror. "Nick," I screamed. I heard him laughing as he shouted, "This way." I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, unable to tell which way was correct. Tears began pouring out of my eyes as I struggled to breathe under the weight of my panic. Every direction I looked was a reflection of myself, each one looking more ominous than the last. I turned a corner and saw hundreds of reflections of the back of my head, all lined up in a row. I was paralyzed with fear. I closed my eyes and took a few shuddering, deep breaths. "Nick," I called out again. This time, I got no answer. I knew to get out I was going to have to open my eyes. There was no way I was making it out of their blind. I opened my eyes and was greeted with the same sight I had seen when I had closed them. I exhaled loudly. A tiny wave of relief hit me. I heard a noise to my right and turned my head that way. "Nick?" I asked again. When I looked forward again, all of my reflections were facing away from me, all except the one in front. She was facing me with a horrible grin plastered onto her face. She beckoned for me. As if in a trance, I could only shake my head. When I didn't move forward, her grin turned into a snarl, and she began slamming her fists against the glass. I let out a blood-curdling scream as I saw my vision go spotty. I stepped back in such a panic that I smashed into the mirror behind me. I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head as a shower of glass rained down around me. I'm certain I passed out for a moment, both from pain and fear. When I came to, I could feel something warm and sticky dripping down my back. I reached up my hand, and it came away bloody. "Fuck," I moaned. I could faintly hear Nick yelling for me. I dragged myself up into a sitting position, wincing as my hands and legs got further cut up from the glass. Across the room, I could see Nick, and hundreds of Nick's reflections, kneeling down in front of me. I closed and rubbed my eyes, shaking my head in the process. How could Nick be with my reflection when he wasn't here with me? I must have hit my head harder than I thought to myself. I could hear him talking, but it sounded muted and far away. I heard the word "help," but not much more. He stood up and sprinted for the door. I couldn't tell if he was coming back or not, and as it seemed like I could get up and walk, I decided to try. I was still anxious to get out of this hall of horrors. I finally made it to the exit door. It had become extremely foggy and unseasonably cold while we were inside. The air had a terrible metallic tang to it that filled my nose and mouth. I shivered in the wind that whipped brutally around me. As I glanced around, I realized that I didn't see anyone else nearby. No people, no cars, nothing. Grimacing, I whipped out my phone to call for an ambulance myself. But the battery was dead. "Come on," I yelled in frustration. I slowly started hobbling towards the road. I figured I could at least catch a cab. But there was no one on the road either. I began to cry again. What a nightmare this night turned out to be. I staggered home, alone and freezing. When I got back inside, I plugged my phone in. I needed to let someone know that I was hurt and where I ended up. When the phone powered on, a barrage of texts came in, mostly from Nick. But they were all jumbled up. A random mix of letters, numbers, and symbols. I couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. I tried to send a text back, but it refused to send. I couldn't even get a signal to make a call. Panic, bitter like bile, threatened to rise up again, but I fought it off. I would deal with the shoddy cell service later. For now, I needed to take care of myself. Once I started to clean myself up, I quickly realized that most of my cuts were shallow or superficial. I was able to get the glass out and get everything cleaned up on my own. Well, every piece except one. I could feel one near the top of my head that I just couldn't get a good grip on. I closed my eyes and let out a deep breath. I was going to need to use the mirror. I hobbled into the guest room and slowly pulled away the sheet. Before, there had been nothing more frightening than seeing my reflection in the mirror. But that night, I realized there was one thing more terrifying than seeing my reflection in the mirror. Not seeing it at all. The Banshee. I consider myself to be a logical being. My experiences in life have led me to such a conclusion that approaching problems from a skeptical and logical viewpoint is in my best interest, and is, as far as I understand it, the best way to live one's life. Not to say that those who place a greater self-interest and reliance in supernatural and spiritual matters are lesser in any way. But I am solely attempting to say that such beliefs haven't appeared necessary to myself in my many years of experience as a lawyer, a career that I have practiced for more than 23 years. There has only been one episode in my life that I could with any certainty deem supernatural in nature. And that is the episode which I will attempt to recount to you, dear reader, from the best of my memory at this time. The year was 1955. I was a young man at the time, and had just begun my postgraduate studies in law at Yale University in Connecticut. I was a particularly adventurous youth, oftentimes to my own detriment, and sought out any and all excuses to travel, have adventures as I liked to think of them, and escape from my studies, something which I now regret. Though my experiences have provided me with plenty of knowledge for which I will forever be grateful, it was at one of these times, when my adventuring spirit was at a high point, that my brother Josiah invited me to spend a few weeks with him in Brazil. Josiah had moved recently there to teach English at the Catholic University of Petrópolis in the state of Rio de Janeiro. I assume he suffered from the same adventurous spirit as myself, a curse that no doubt impelled him to take up the venture in the first place. The thought of traveling to Brazil seized my spirits, and though I would certainly miss a period of classes, the trip would be brief, and I felt confident that I could both complete any assignments while in Brazil and catch up upon my return if necessary. After some debate, it was decided that perhaps a period of only 1 week would be better for my vacation, and my brother wasted no time in purchasing the airline tickets and making the necessary arrangements. I felt that the pricing must have been expensive, and I offered to pay for some of the expense, but he declined, insisting that his recent employment had given him more money than he and his young family needed, and he was anxious to use some of his newly acquired funds for some good cause, and that he was looking forward to seeing me. The day of the trip arrived. I brought with me only a mid-sized suitcase with clothes for the week and a few school supplies. The plane ride was comfortable enough, although I couldn't sleep to save my life. I never could sleep on planes, and the length of the journey was enough to exhaust one's spirits. After what seemed hours of fitful tossing and turning, I drifted off. when I awoke. Day had already broken, and it was almost time for our descent. I was served a small breakfast of something or other, and the plane landed in Rio de Janeiro. Josiah had spoken very highly of Brazil, so my expectations were somewhat heightened. My first impression of Brazil was that the landscape was very beautiful, and I found myself constantly looking around at the immense cliffs and green hills that seemed to roll forth from the ocean and out of the earth like something from a dream. The city itself was small, I thought, at least compared to the other great cities of the world that I had visited. But set against this tropical and gorgeous coastline, one couldn't deny that this was a desirable place to be. I can only imagine the kind of nightlife that took place here, the parties being somewhat legendary. I myself never got to see these for myself. Perhaps one day I'll return. I count myself blessed for simply having been there and seen the natural beauty of Rio de Janeiro. The people I found extremely friendly, if lacking in fluent English. Many of them, I think, were overconfident in their ability to speak the language. But I guess that they got by with what they knew in order to make ends meet. And as my bus took me through the sprawling brick suburbs, I saw people peddling goods and selling food to the tourists. So it seems to me my hunch was correct in that regard. The bus ride to Petropolis was easy enough, and there I did manage to fall asleep. When I awoke, I looked out the window to see a sheer drop of several hundred feet. We were climbing a mountain on a thin stretch of road that clung to the side of the mountain. One more foot to the left and our bus would hurtle down to our certain doom. I closed my eyes until the terror had passed. Heights are something that even a logical man can be afraid of, I think, without anyone judging him for it. Petropolis, I learned, is also known as the Imperial City. Back when Brazil still had emperors, this is where they had their summer homes, a fairly common practice at the time for aristocrats and important persons. The city was established by the Germans in the 18th century, and the cultural and architectural effects of the motherland are extremely evident. As soon as we entered Petropolis, I felt as if we were in a different country. The streets were cobblestone. The buildings were constructed in semi-timber architecture, with the wooden cross beams exposed over white plaster, as is common in Germany. It reminded me of my trip to Europe, and I must confess, and I had not anticipated finding this level of sophistication and culture in Brazil. Josiah met me at the bus station, and we boarded a bus back to his home. Petropolis, I found, was constructed of individual neighborhoods, or barrios, as they are called here. Josiah lived in the Barrio Coronel Vega, outside of the city. The ride wasn't long, and I found that Petropolis too was a city built into the mountains, with enormous, rising hillsides that stretched up into the clouds. It rained often here. In fact, it was one of the rainiest cities on earth, and the constant rain and humidity caused an almost constant fog to fall upon the hill, giving it a haunted and mystical quality. The rising hills seemed to disappear in the clouds. The houses were constructed in such a way that they were almost stacked, one on top of the other, built into the hills themselves. Long, straight staircases climbed up the hills, providing the only access to the houses that weren't directly on the street, which was most of them. It seemed a rather poor system, according to my judgment, and the thought of those poor people having to climb enormous staircases every day just to arrive at their homes made my heart weep for them. No one had yards or actual property. To my eternal disappointment, I discovered that Josiah was one of those who lived on the middle level of one of these hills. So in order to reach his home, we had to climb up half a mountain to get there, up a long and steep staircase made of stone. The home in which they lived was divided into two parts. The lower home, which was comprised of 2 floors, and on the interior was very American in style, and the upper section which served as an extra apartment that they could rent out or lend to guests. And it was this section of the house that I was given as my quarters during my stay. The apartment had a separate entrance, and one had to step outside and climb the stone steps up to the next level to find the door to the apartment, as the apartment itself actually rested upon my brother's home. Now I've spent a great deal of time lecturing, it feels, upon the wonders of Brazil and of my journey and impressions of the country. I assure you, reader, my tale does take a darker turn. My first evening there was spent in good company, and Josiah and myself spent a good deal of time talking and reminiscing until long after dinner was over into the late hours of the night, as siblings often do after long separations. His wife retired the children, and rejoined us as we were finishing our second bottle of wine. As she entered the room, the clock on the wall signaled the hour. Midnight. How quickly the time had passed. Josiah was quick to apologize, as he would have to excuse himself from my company. The college awaited him in the morning. I, too, was exhausted from my journey, and wasted no time in bidding adieu to my family, and heading out onto the dark staircase and into my chambers. I lit several candles, but somehow that only seemed to intensify my isolation. It may have been the elongated shadows, or the constant flickering of the flame that made me feel as if someone were in the room with me. My quarters were small, consisting of a sloped ceiling, a feather bed, a bathroom, and a kitchen. There was even a desk that looked out a set of glass doors and a small balcony. Josiah had warned me not to use the balcony, as it was in repair, and the railing was not yet sturdy enough to use. Frankly, I had no desire to use the balcony, as my previous description of my bus ride might have led you to guess. I am afraid of heights, though the view from the window was striking enough, looking out over the hills and valley below. I was content to view it all from behind the glass barrier. I had hardly laid myself down upon my mattress when I heard a haunting sound. My first instinct was that it was the wind, howling around the jagged houses perched along the mountain. But the noise seemed to grow louder, as if it were growing closer. It was a woman, I realized, sobbing somewhere outside. She must be hurt. I jumped from my bed and looked out the small glass pane above my bed. What I saw as I looked from that window was an image that is forever engraved in my mind. A ghostly apparition, it seemed, was climbing the stairs just outside my chambers. A woman wrapped in a ragged shawl climbed, wailing quite loudly. Surely the whole neighborhood must be awake. Slowly, she climbed, until eventually her cries began to fade. For a long while I could not move. I was frozen in place. It seemed her cries had the effect of casting fear throughout my whole body, so that I was stiff and unable to do anything. I do not know how long I stood there, watching, unable to move. At some point I must have, as I woke up the next morning in my bed feeling far from refreshed, the memory of last night still burning in my mind. I dressed and went downstairs to join my family. In the light of day, the stairs seemed ordinary, plain. There was no sign or signal that this was a place where spirits walked and wailed during the night. A haunted place. I could not resist the urge to bring up the subject over breakfast, though some might frown upon my engaging such a topic in the presence of children. I feel that it was not a sin, as they too must be victims of the woman's nighttime visit. "How are you this morning, brother?" Josiah asked, that young and jovial smile of his ever present across his face. "Did you sleep well?" I wish I could say that I have, but it seems there was some ungodly creature who decided to scream the night away right outside my window. At my mention of the woman, Josiah and his wife shared a frightened glance. The look might have been looked over by some, but not by myself, a student of the law. They knew something. Ah, yes. It's a neighborhood drunk, no more. She does that from time to time. I'm sorry I didn't mention it. Mention it, my good brother, all is forgiven. She is not your doing. Then all is well. Tonight I shall retire a little more prepared. Though I can't imagine what happened to that poor wretch to make her so dreadfully sad. Poor girl. And that was that on the subject. A common drunk. Though I sensed she might be more than that, I dare not suggest it. Logic constrained me. And what could she be, other than a drunk? A memory swam into my mind of something Josiah told me when I was younger. There is such a thing as a banshee, he said, a woman who wails and cries warning of a death to come. A banshee. The lawyer inside me scoffed at the idea. Children's stories, to keep them good and in their bed. but my memory of the night before would not leave my mind. It haunted me all the day long. Dread aside, the day was rather pleasant. There was much laughter, as there often is when families come together. I took advantage of my visit to see some of the sights of Petropolis, including the Palacio di Cristal, a building made entirely of glass for the sole purpose of demonstrating engineering prowess. It was quite remarkable and reminded of me of the larger structure that had once stood in Chicago, and I very much wished that I could have seen it. After exploring the city for the afternoon, I found myself at the Imperial Museum, where the emperor himself once lived. The most impressive structure to me, however, was the church, St. Peter's of Alcantara, an enormous cathedral that overlooks the city square. I never would have thought coming to Brazil that I would find impressive Gothic architecture. Yet here it was standing right before my eyes. The interior of the church was just as impressive, and after exploring, I found myself below ground, reading inscriptions on the ancient tombs in the burial crypt. This is where the last emperor himself was buried, and as I looked around, I found myself suddenly alone. Alone with the dead, I thought, how perfect. It seemed that death was following me everywhere I went. Well, seeing as I could not stay here by myself any longer, I quickly made my way to the stairs, and as I was reaching the top, the door swung closed all by itself. I tried the handle, but the door was locked tight. Minutes passed. I was alone in the dark, and no amount of banging or shouting seemed to be doing me any good. Terror soon began to set in, and I began to think this trip was entirely a mistake. I had just about given up hope and resolved to die here in the dark when I heard footsteps. I resumed my pounding on the door. Evidently, this time someone heard me and the door was thrown open. Light poured in. Disculpa, amigo. Quanto tempo voce estive aquí? I'm sorry, I speak English. I'm an American. Ah, American, English. The man before me was short, balding, with a long, single twisting eyebrow. I don't want to seem judgmental or rude, but he was not a pleasant man to look upon. His eyes seemed to bulge out of his head, giving him a bug-like quality to him. However, he was kind enough, and he escorted me back to the chapel where we engaged in a friendly conversation. His name was Wagner, I learned, and he was a bus driver here in the city. His English was poor, but he seemed eager to talk to me, and even more eager to learn about America. When I told him that I was a student at Yale, his eyes seemed to grow even larger. Yale rich, your family, lots of money. Well, I suppose you could say that. Yale isn't cheap. No, lots of money to learn at university. And so our conversation went. Eventually, I grew tired of trying to decipher what the man was getting at, and the time was growing late. So I bid him adieu and caught the next bus back to Josiah's house. As I was walking down the foggy street to the long staircase, I saw something ahead of me on the side of the road. It looked almost like an animal digging, but it was large, and for a moment I was seized with fear. An animal that large could be dangerous. What kind of animals did they have here in Brazil? I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me. I felt a stranger here, in a strange land. I assume most travelers at one point or another feel some level of this as they come to terms with a foreign place. But the fog cleared somewhat, and I was able to distinguish that the creature was actually a person, digging in a pile of trash. I approached the person. Their face was covered in filthy rags, ridden with holes. As I neared, the thing turned its head in my direction, and I saw the face that was hidden from me the night before. The woman's face from the stairs. It was a face that was completely unforgettable, insane pale eyes, a scarred face covered in dirt and warts, and hair that shot out in all directions from despair. This was no human. This was an animal. I quickly turned and continued on my way, not daring to look back. As I reached the stairs, I felt impelled to run, which resulted in my walking at a slightly quicker pace, just in case anyone was watching. I had almost reached Josiah's house when I decided to look back, and much to my surprise, I found the woman standing at the foot of the stair, looking up at me, as if she were waiting to see which house I entered. Terrified, and unable to stay where I was under the foul woman's gaze, I ran up the rest of the stairs and into Josiah's house. For the rest of the evening, I was considerably shaken up, and Josiah could tell from my silence that something was off. But he could not get out of me what it was, and I could not bring myself to tell him what was causing me such anguish and paranoia. I'm simply tired from running about all day. I don't think I've fully recovered from the journey. Such excuses continued until I almost believed them myself, and I excused myself much earlier than the night previous and left for my apartment. As I exited Josiah's house, I carried a lantern with me and looked both ways on the stairs to see if the woman was there, waiting for me. I could not see her, but it was a considerably foggy night, and I could not see the bottom of the stairs. I quickly ran up to my apartment door, unlocked it, and slammed it behind me. Only once I was inside with the door locked did I feel safe, though it took a moment for my heart to calm. I had to do something to distract my cursed imagination. Never had I felt this level of terror since I was a child. This was no spirit, no banshee. This was a human being, tormented, yes, but nothing more. I decided to try some reading to distract myself. I had to keep up on my schoolwork anyways, so I took out one of my textbooks and began to read. For the first while I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept wandering to the woman on the stairs, but I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember I heard a sobbing, and my head shot up, back to consciousness. It was her. She had once again begun her nightly climb. I took up my lantern and rushed to the glass doors to the porch overlooking the valley. Down below, I could see her on the stairs, climbing and wailing, heading my direction. Chills began to run down my spine. I did not like the idea of her coming this way, or standing outside my door. But what could she do? Logic argued inside me. She was simply a drunk woman. The city was full of them. Then why was my heart pounding inside my chest? Why was I fixating on her, and why did she terrify me? Soon the woman grew near. I could hear her feet shuffling outside on the stone steps. She was outside my apartment now. I could hear her cries. I could hardly take it. I just wanted her to be gone. And soon she was. She continued to climb, upwards, into the fog, finishing her nightly ascent to heaven knows where. I decided that I was being a coward. She was just a woman, and soon a new curiosity took hold me of. I found myself crossing the room and unlocking my door. Where did this new bravery spring from? Where was it taking me? But I knew the answer. It was taking me to the woman. Up the stairs, my ascent was quick, and I carried the lantern with me into the fog. Soon the mist enveloped me, and I could see nothing but the stairs in front of me. Before long, I found myself once again on level ground. I had reached the top of the stairs. The mist was somewhat clearer up here, and I could see that I was standing in a road. More houses were built on up either side of me. So this is where the woman climbed to each night. It seems silly now to have followed her here. Whatever her reasons for climbing those stairs, it was none of my business. I looked around for her, without success. She seemed to have vanished, perhaps into one of the houses. Perhaps this is where she lived. I suddenly felt very alone and vulnerable. Why had I come here? I was a fool. I turned to return the way I came, and there she was, standing right behind me in the night. The woman, she screamed, and I'll never forget the way my heart grew cold, those terrible eyes staring right into my soul. The next thing I knew, I was lying in my bed, caught in a terrible sweat. Had it really happened? I could not say. But I knew that the woman was real, and I was still in my apartment in Brazil. The memory or dream stood burning like a fire in my mind. I rose and looked out the wide window. The day was overcast and raining, clouds as far as I could see. That day was spent indoors, as the weather would not allow me to leave. Somehow being close to the stairs was the worst thing for me, and I found myself dreading having to climb up to my apartment alone. After too much schoolwork and many card games with my niece, Josiah returned from the university and preparations began for dinner. We were short one ingredient, and I volunteered to go down to the bakery and fetch it. Some fresh air would do me some good, I reasoned. I put on a poncho and descended the wet, slippery steps to the street below. The walk was a brisk one, and the wind was howling the entire way to the end of the street. It seemed an ill omen, as if I could not escape the woman's howling, even now during the day. The rain followed me wherever I went, and despite my poncho, I found myself soaked from head to foot by the time I stepped into the bakery. Using my basic understanding of Portuguese, I was able to conduct a transaction for some additional flour, and as I about to walk out the door, who should I run into but Wagner from the day before? He seemed glad to see me, and though I didn't want to stay and talk, I indulged the poor chap for a moment, mostly as a favor for my rescue the other day. He invited me to come with him to his place for dinner. I politely refused. Some other time, perhaps, I suggested. It seems he didn't like my refusal of his invitation. I'm not familiar with the customs of Brazil. It may be that I offended his honor and broke some sort of cultural custom, but I did not trust the man, and I would risk offending one villager for the exchange of my own safety. I quickly walked home, and this time on the stairs I did not look back. The evening seemed to pass too quickly. Dinner ended, conversation began, but once again I found myself distracted. All I could think about was the woman. What if she was a banshee? I wondered. Was she trying to warn me? Was someone going to die? I suddenly began to feel very ill, and paranoia set in. Who could it be? My brother, his wife, myself. I returned to my apartment, and no sooner had I entered than I heard the woman on the stairs, howling and wailing. I stepped back out to watch. I wanted to see her. There she was on the stairs below, howling and sobbing, making her way towards me. I stepped back inside. The rain was still pounding down, and I wondered at how she was able to stay brave the elements. I stayed in the doorway for what seemed like an eternity. The sobbing had stopped, I realized. She was gone. Had I missed her? Perhaps she turned back because of the weather. I opened the door to see what had become of her, only to find her standing right before me. She looked into my eyes and emitted the most terrible shriek I've ever heard. I felt like my bones had turned to glass and were about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. I fell back inside, stumbling and falling onto the ground. To my terror, the woman entered. She looked around, lifted a white, ghostly hand, and pointed into the darkness of my bedchamber. She wailed again, breaking into a fit of sobbing. I turned to where she was pointing and was shocked again to find a man standing there in the dim light. He stepped forward, his hiding place revealed. It was Wagner, waiting for me in my own house. He carried a sharp metal pole in his hands, no doubt to be used with malicious intent. He wasted no time, swinging the stick at me, trying to impale me. I rolled out of the way, backing up towards the far end of the room. He was trapping me. Soon I would have nowhere to go. Wagner wound up for one final swing. I dodged it, falling and rolling on the ground. But Wagner had put too much force into his swing. He lost his balance and fell forward. A heavy gust of wind swept through the house, pulling the glass doors open as he fell upon them. The balcony broke underneath his weight, and Wagner fell from sight. I looked out the window to see his body on the stairs below. I turned, but the wailing woman was gone. I ran to the door and looked up and down the stairs, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. To this day, I cannot say what became of the woman, but I do know what I saw, and I admit I cannot explain it. Some things cannot be explained away by ration. That much I have learned and am able to admit. And even if I live my life as a rational man, ruled by logic and facts, I will never be able to deny my own supernatural experience of the woman on the stairs. What's your name, darling? Annie. Well, Annie, do you know why I'm sitting here right now? Annie shook her head from side to side. For once, she did not know the answer to a question asked in class. I'm sitting here because I was the only applicant to fill this position. All the other substitutes that are on file here weren't up for taking on the job. It's the middle of September, so it's almost as if they'd taken on the role of teaching the entire school year. It's never easy to find a permanent replacement when a teacher passes, but Principal Curtis was lucky enough that I applied. Annie was continuing to sit at full attention while Miss Davis spoke. The other students either had their eyes on her or the teacher. Either way, not a soul in the room was distracted. So, to answer your statement about him not liking our discussion or my language, he doesn't really have a choice. There's no one to replace me. Now, are you going to sit here like the rest of the class and listen to what I have to say, or go to the front office and file a complaint about me? Annie's lower lip quivered. She dared not speak another word. That's what I thought. Miss Davis turned her gaze away from her and back over the class. She scanned their faces and noticed that not even one had a trace of boredom. Like I was saying, I'm going to clear some things up about the aftermath in Haddonfield. First, we need to discuss what happened. The classroom tensed up. On Halloween night in 1978, 3 teenagers were brutally murdered on the street where my mother grew up. She considers it a blessing every day that her home wasn't the one targeted. Unfortunately, the people living a couple of doors down weren't so lucky. Their daughter and her boyfriend were found in their house. There was one other victim found strangled in her car. After those 3 were killed, another person almost perished that night. Her name is Laurie Strode, and she's the only one to survive an attack by this man. Miss Davis leaned over and scrolled the wheel on her mouse. The page moved down, and the image of a white novelty mask filled the screen. Michael Myers. She felt the words struggle to come out of her mouth. Just saying them made a bitter taste appear in the back of her throat. Who can tell me something about Michael Myers? She asked while looking at her students. No one said a word. Everyone's eyes were glued to the screen in intense fascination. The almost sickly white glow of the projector illuminated their faces, exposing every detail. The only sound that could be heard was the wind faintly blowing against the windows outside. A boy in the second row slowly raised his hand. I remember seeing him in a show on Investigation Discovery. They said that Laurie was actually his sister. Miss Davis pinched the bridge of her nose and let out a slow breath. This is why so much needs to be cleared up. She repositioned herself on the desk and crossed her legs. Why do you think we, as human beings, have such a fascination with something like this? What makes a man, if you can classify him as one, like Michael Myers, so appealing to us? Although the classroom remained quiet at first, a girl in the front row eventually spoke. I think it's because we all have some amount of interest in disturbing things like this. None of us want to admit it, but it's true. Miss Davis rested her head in the palm of her hand while pondering what the girl had just said. That's a good answer. What's your name? Linda, the girl said in a shy tone. Then tell me, Linda, if we all have at least a mild form of interest in disturbing and gruesome acts, then why were the Haddonfield crimes so exaggerated? One would think that a monster like Michael Myers would be enough to satisfy that craving. Sadly, that could be no further from the truth. Miss Davis leaned over to the computer once more and scrolled down a couple of pages. She stopped on an image of a tabloid cover. The title stood out in an obnoxiously yellow font. Lone survivor shares blood with killer. This, right here, is the root of all the misconceptions you and the public have with the Haddonfield murders. One would think that such a story would be enough to shake anyone to their core. But for some reason, people felt the need to make up lies. They started out small at first, but grew and became uncontrollable. My mother said there was one instance where she was waiting in line to check out at the grocery store. On a rack of tabloids and other garbage magazines was a badly edited photograph of Michael Myers filing away at his prison bars with a nail file. Although I was not born yet on the night of the murders, my mother can still recall it in vivid detail. What made Michael's killing spree truly horrifying to her, and everyone else in town, was that no one thought something like this could have happened in their own backyard. For the rest of the country, they saw nothing more than a white mask with a news caption underneath it. Where others saw a casual conversation topic, the people of Haddonfield saw the face of pure evil. This is what the problem with all this misinformation boils down to. If someone wasn't physically there, something had to be exaggerated to really grab their attention. Every student was staring at Miss Davis, either out of respect or a silent means of hiding their discomfort. My mother refused to talk about that night with me until I was about 13. Up until that point, I was just like the rest of you. I thought Michael Myers was nothing more than a face used to sell less than reputable stories. It wasn't until my mother told me every detail that I truly understood what lurked behind the black eyes of that mask. When the police discovered the bodies, it seemed that the whole neighborhood, my mother included, turned up to watch from the sidelines. Most of the people lining the sidewalk were still wearing Halloween costumes. As the first body was taken from the house on a gurney with a sheet draped over it, the crowd began to realize the weight of what had happened. All voices were hushed as the night air was filled only with the sound of wind and tumbling leaves. One by one, the bodies were pulled from the house. Gradually, local news vans swarmed the area. By this time, my mother and her friends had returned home. It wasn't until later in the night that they captured Michael Myers. Apparently, he had been shot by his psychiatrist while attempting to flee. As two police officers took the injured man towards a police car, he was approached by the cameraman of a smaller news station. My mother said that when he approached the officers, he asked them to take Michael's mask off. To this day, she can still remember what happened next with vivid detail. One of the officers grabbed onto the top of the mask and slowly lifted it off. What the camera saw next was the face of no man, but living proof that Satan himself walks this earth. My mother recalled him looking like any other man you might see walking down the street. It wasn't until she looked at his eyes that she realized what Michael really was. Burning deep inside those seemingly empty eyes was something she can still only describe as pure evil. Now to some of you, that sounds like a cliché, but I want you all to stop and think for a moment. Close your eyes and try to imagine this. Think about what it must be like for a person to be purely evil. I'm not talking about cruel intentions. I'm talking about a complete lack of remorse and no compassion for human life. Imagine what a person must be like to see a human being as nothing more than a tally to add to the scoreboard. Miss Davis scrolled the computer screen once more until an image of a man flashed on the screen. He stared into the camera with a blank expression. Many of you know Michael Myers as a man in a mask from all those TV shows, but very few, if any at all, have actually seen what he truly looks like. Trying to sell a human face as evil didn't work as well as the mask. To this day, the people of Haddonfield still fear that face. Although some fear it more than others, it seems that everyone understands what feasted on the innocence of their town all those years ago. She scrolled the screen to the bottom of the web page. The last article was dated as being published a couple of years after the murders. This was the last article that any of those magazines published about Michael. It was almost as if by the following week, the world had forgotten about him. He was now in prison, and the country moved on to the next sickening story that satisfied their hunger for disgust. However, the nightmare wasn't over for Haddonfield. Everyone in town knew that Michael was in prison, but that hardly did anything to settle their nerves. He had broken out once, so the fear that he would do it again lingered over the town. To this day, some residents still fear that he will return. This is the difference between Haddonfield and the rest of the country. Everyone else got their sick kicks watching news stories about him, while Haddonfield lived in his shadow for years to come. When I was growing up, the fear of Michael Myers had dwindled some, but still had a strong presence over our town. No one took enjoyment from hearing his name or reading about his killings. Parents set strict curfews for their children. They acted as if Michael could easily appear from anywhere and unleash hell upon the town once more. None of you can know what it's like to grow up in fear of something so evil that just the sheer mention of his name would send a chill down your spine and make your stomach churn. There was always the lingering feeling that someone was following you, or that someone was watching through your bedroom window. This wasn't like being afraid of a monster in your closet. In our case, the monster had walked the streets, and you could still see the footprints. To the rest of the country, Michael was just a face. To Haddonfield, he was a horrific evil who still cast a shadow over the town. Sadly, the media couldn't exactly sell our view of what he really was. So instead, they turned him into a gimmick until there was hardly any truth to his story. With time, I've learned that an exaggerated lie sells better than the plain truth. Miss Davis stopped talking and studied the class. Some girls had shrunk back in their seat, while others were nervously glancing around. Even some of the boys seemed to be on edge. The discussion had begun with the class listening eagerly, but slowly devolved into an understanding of true evil. Some had handled it better than others, but even the strongest had been broken. This is why I don't talk about Haddonfield around other people. They see Michael Myers as nothing more than a novelty meant to fill late-night time slots and be a brief discussion topic over drinks. To us, he still walks the streets of our little town. He still watches people through their windows at night. He still waits in the shadows to claim his next victim. She scrolled back to the image of an unmasked Michael Myers and zoomed in on his eyes until they filed the screen. When the Haddonfield sheriff was interviewed about that night, he talked about his discussions with the psychiatrist, Dr. Loomis. According to him, Dr. Loomis had stated that in all the years he had observed Michael, he was never really looking at him. Instead, Michael was looking past everything, looking at that night in 1978. Miss Davis glanced back at the screen. Even after all these years, the sight of his gaze managed to fill her with an unsettling sense of dread. My mother has told me numerous times over the years what she saw in his eyes that night on the television. At that moment, Michael wasn't looking into the camera. He was looking past that, and what he saw was another night. The night he would return to Haddonfield. A single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it with the back of her sleeve before turning to the class. In some ways, though, it's almost as if he never left.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling content.